Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Cass MMA, and today I'm just going to be sort of getting into the TKO Boxing things that have been going on in the past few days and how I think it's going to affect the UFC in a positive or negative way. First of all, what we really have to start with is the power balance between Dana White and Turki Al-Sheikh, because if Turkey contains all of the cards, it's not going to affect the UFC at all. But the reality of it is, I think Dana's going to be really involved. And I think Dana's involvement is going to surpass... It's not going to be more than the involvement he has in the UFC. But, if right now 100% of his time is toward the UFC, it will be 70-30. So there's going to be a lot of Dana's time that is sort of pulled away from the UFC and then to focus on TKO. And I think this is really going to change the UFC, because I'm interested in the fact that Dana's role in the UFC will continue to shrink, because in honesty it has been shrinking. I put a picture of a young Dana White up here, back when Dana did everything. He had the matchmaking, he had the promotion, he had the press conferences. But the guy who was left, Hunter Campbell, does a lot of that stuff now. Sean Shelby do a lot of that stuff. Dana has almost turned into a figurehead for the UFC, rather than the actual head. And if you guys watched the Hunter Campbell documentary, you would see Hunter Campbell's running a lot of the day-to-day stuff. And I don't think Dana's ever going to leave as president of the UFC, because he's so attached to the company. And he's said on numerous occasions that he's never going to leave. He's never going to stop being the president of the UFC. But as Dana's role continues to shrink, I think the UFC will get a better product. I mean, I'm sort of also going to use this to segue into the Jones Aspinall stuff that's been going on in the past few days, where Dana's now said that Jones Aspinall is going to happen in the summer, and if Pereira wins, then he's going to face the winner. But I don't think that Dana wants his fight, but Dana's not going to be willing to do everything. Dana's not going to be willing to go as far against Jon Jones now as he was willing to 10 years ago, or even in 2020. I remember there was a quote of Dana in 2020 where he said, "You can say, show me the money, but you really want to fight the guy." Dana now was just assuming Jon Jones wants to fight, even though Jon Jones has given us no signs that he actually wants to fight Tom Aspinall. And obviously I really hope that this fight happens this summer, but the way it's going right now, I don't think it will. And as Dana starts to be phased out, here's the thing. I think Dana being phased out was inevitable, but I think TKO is going to be the route in which Dana is phased out. There was going to be a time when Dana didn't put as much time in the UFC, where he moved by the era of being the head, doing everything in the UFC. But Dana always needed something else to do. I think that Dana has conquered the MMA world. Dana has taken this small company, he's made it into a $1 billion organization. He's taken a company that was $40 million in debt, and made it into what the UFC is now. And Dana's done an incredible job with this overall. So when I say Dana leaving makes the UFC a better product, I don't mean to disrespect the great work that Dana did 15 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. But now, Dana's sort of lost it. Dana maybe isn't as into the sport. Dana might be a little bit too busy promoting Power Slap with fucking OnlyFans girls. Dana isn't as locked in on the UFC as he was in the past. And that's why I think that as Dana begins to phase out, it's just going to be realistically a less watered down version of the Hunter Campbell control that we have right now. Because if you think Dana's the one making a David Onama versus Giga Chikadze matchup, he's just not. Dana's not stacking the prelims of a fight night. Dana's not setting up Hyder Emil versus William Gomez or these type of bangers. Dana might come in when it's time to go on First Take, when it's time to go on Shannon Sharp's show. He'll do the press conferences. But as we sort of move this figurehead away, move Dana towards TKO, this allows Hunter Campbell to have a real total grasp on the company in a way where he won't need to share control with Dana White. He won't need to split value, he won't need to split control. He can just take over it all, run it himself, and maybe run it to the best the company's ever been. And and I think with Dana being phased out, we're gonna see more. I think the overall structure of the UFC will change. I anticipate this being what leads to a little bit higher fighter pay. I think, and this has been talked about, right now the UFC is paying guys like Jim Miller like $500K for each time he fights. As these older guys sort of begin to be phased out, we replace them with Dana White's Contender Series guys. I think you're gonna slowly see like the UFC increase their overall fighter pay structure, because if they want to attract anybody in TKO Boxing, you can't have the same fighter pay structure as you have in the UFC. In the UFC fighters might look at the TKO Boxing pay structure and say, we need something similar to that, because if the UFC wants to bring in the Canelos, the Terrence Crawfords, they can't pay them the same they're paying the UFC stars right now. So yeah, that's why this is sort of one of my next points. It's just the pay structure change. The UFC are gonna need to compensate their athletes more than they're doing at the moment. If they want to have a success, like their boxing athletes are gonna make more money than the MMA fighters are making right now. That's just the reality of it. Because if you want to attract anybody in boxing, you have to pay them a lot. That's what I think is gonna enable us to get fights like John Jones versus Tom Aspinall done, where John Jones gets his $30 million that he wants. Because John Jones can look and say, like, I think TKO's first fight is going to be Terrence Crawford versus Canelo Alvarez in September. John Jones can look and say, well, you just paid Canelo $20 million for this huge fight versus Terrence Crawford. You just paid Terrence Crawford $30 million to do this huge fight. Why can't I get the same money? Am I making you less money? Is MMA less valuable than boxing now? Which I don't think it will be. So I think this is going to sort of lead to the UFC increasing their MMA fighters' pay and Dana being phased out, because TKO Boxing is going to almost distract Dana and make Hunter Campbell have more control. And I think honestly Power Slap has had a similar effect on Dana. Power Slap is sort of taking him a little bit away from the UFC since it started, because it's like Power Slap is his love project. Power Slap is what he does for fun. And yeah, so I just really hope that this TKO build ends up actually improving the UFC. But the one worry that I have is there's a good chance Dana White still continues to control a lot of the UFC while controlling a lot of TKO, but he just won't put as much time into the UFC. So we'll just have a watered down version of Dana himself, still doing all the stuff he does now, while investing less time in the UFC. So that's the one outcome which I really hope doesn't happen, because of how unfortunate it'd be for honestly all UFC fans and the UFC as a whole as a company, because it would sort of plateau the growth the UFC has had over the last few years, where the UFC's been doing really good. And obviously this weekend we have one of the biggest light heavyweight fights we've had in forever. And I just wanted to say also, just really briefly, we're not going to get Pereira versus Usyk. Dana White said himself that yesterday that this doesn't mean that MMA guys are going to go into boxing and boxing guys are going to MMA. He's going to keep them strictly separate. So the really only link between TKO and the UFC is going to be Dana White and the ownership. So that's why I think the only real effects that the TKO Boxing promotion is going to have on the UFC are an increase in fighter pay and Dana White leaving his role and sort of shrinking and just becoming a figurehead even more so than he is now, to the point that I think Hunter Campbell might even start running the post-fight interviews and stuff like that. Anyway, thanks for watching. I'll drop a Aspinall Jones video tomorrow, and I'll see you guys then.